everyone, and welcome to this session of the Speakeasy webinars. I'm Charles Frye, and I'll be talking to you today about ChatGPT and Speakeasy. So just let me know in that chat if there's any audio or video issues, so I can resolve them. It's a new video platform for me, so that's exciting. I'm coming to you here from Oakland, California. It's a rainy afternoon for me. If you want to say hi in the chat, let me know where you're joining from, what time it is, and how the weather is. I'd love to hear it over there in the chat on the right-hand side. You can also post questions there. I think there's probably going to be lots of questions, in particular about the the artificial intelligence side, about the language modeling side, and I'm happy to answer any of those questions. Yeah. Oh, I see. We saw hello to Mike joining us from the UK, where it happens to be rainy. I'm sure that's quite rare. All right, let me switch over here and start this presentation. So the TLDR on this presentation is that the combination of ChatGPT and Speakeasy, it's like peanut butter and chocolate. It's a Reese's situation. They complement each other in a new workflow for spec improvement, for the improvement of OpenAPI specs. And with Speakeasy, that means the improvement of your APIs, and your SDKs. So we'll see a little bit of like what these two tools are, and a real deep dive on the AI side of things, and we'll see what this workflow looks like and how it can improve the spec. I'm also seeing some more hellos there in the chat. Some people, it's sunny. Some people, it's not. Hello to all. Thanks for saying hi. So one of the two tools we're talking about is Speakeasy. Speakeasy helps you with everything that you need in order to get self-service for your API users right now. So everything from your validation of your OpenAPI spec to generation of client SDKs through monitoring and sort of closing the loop to improve and manage the user experience, the developer experience with your API so that more people will integrate it in more places. So that's Speakeasy. ChatGPT, the other tool we'll be talking about today. It's a recently released tool from the folks at OpenAI, which has really taken off and become, by some measures, the fastest growing consumer application ever. It's sort of presented as an artificial intelligence chatbot, like a smarter child that is actually smart, that can write essays, solve problems, write code, and as CNN put it, give human-like, unique results. And so this has been called artificial intelligence to a decent amount of controversy. What artificial intelligence right now mostly means is something called language modeling. So if you look up something like GPT-3, the core model behind ChatGPT on Wikipedia, you'll see it described as an autoregressive language model, a language model that takes all the words that have appeared up to a certain point in a document and guesses what the next word is going to be. So thought of that way, this artificial intelligence stuff is not so novel, not so surprising. The core idea there on guessing what the next word is basically as old as information theory, as old as the concept of bits itself. It was written about by Claude Shannon, the father of information theory, back in the 50s, where he measured people's ability to predict words in English, and then he made statistical models of that. So that's this example on the right-hand side here, where people are guessing letter by letter what the next letter in an English sentence is going to be. And so thought of this way, it seems sort of like, wait a second, that sounds a lot like the autocomplete that I have on my phone. So is this just spicy autocomplete? And it's, San Francisco at it again, overhyping some sort of basic technology. This sort of skepticism has led to the moniker stochastic parrots to describe these large language models that underlie tools like ChatGPT. And in the lineup between parrots and these algorithms, in this view, the parrots win. because they both sort of learn random phrases, don't really understand what they're learning, say nonsense sometimes, but only one of the two is a cute little birdie parrot. Um, so that's the sort of like critical view, maybe a little bit less prominent than the very breathy, excited view that it's artificial intelligence. So as somebody who's been working in this field for about a decade, in my view, they're kind of something in between what we've got here now with something like ChatGPT. And if it's a parrot, it's maybe like this parrot here from parrotshow.biz, which is this parrot that has been trained not just to speak, but also to use tools to be able to pass through a door with a complex locking mechanism, and including using keys to manipulate the locks. So, a parrot properly trained with the right support system and with the right tasks put in front of it can do more than speak. And so in the end, these language models that are underneath ChatGPT are so good at parroting language, at like coming up with things to say, that they can do things that you might want an artificial intelligence to do. So if you were dreaming of what would I do with an artificial intelligence if I had one, then some of those things are things that language models can do right now. So let me go through a couple of those examples. I'm going to try and focus on stuff that I think people are less aware of outside of the sort of like cutting edge of this field. Like I could show you stuff about like autocomplete or writing little fun poems, or like helping you cheat on your English homework. I'm going to try and focus on things that are just like a little bit more exciting, I think, for programmers, and are a little bit more at the edge of what these things are capable of. So yeah, there's a lot more basic stuff than this, but this is the exciting stuff. So one is that language models can use any tool whose interface is text. So APIs, like the ones that we're talking about standing up and improving today, are text-based tools. You just have to write an HTTP request to talk to a REST API. And like many programming languages provide a textual interface. I guess any script is kind of a textual interface, but there's also REPLs that are sort of a more iterative interaction. And language models can use these kinds of textual tools. This is an example of somebody creating a Python program to do this, to answer a really tough trivia question about whether this particular author, David Chanoff, collaborated with a US Navy admiral who served as the ambassador to the United Kingdom under which president. So multi-step kind of reasoning thing. You can augment language models with the ability to express an inner monologue and then execute searches via search APIs. So search APIs, just one particular type of tool, one particular type of textual API. So the language model thinks to itself, I need to search David Chanoff and find the US Navy Admiral. So search David Chanoff, find this information about the Navy Admiral, and then you find information about the Navy Admiral by searching again. And you finally get that the answer is Bill Clinton. So multi-step reasoning and tool use has come to language models. And language models, that was an example from somebody's sort of like Python library, an open source library called LangChain, but this is quickly becoming commoditized. So just within the last week, OpenAI has announced that they are like adding basically an app store of tools to augment their language models with everything from like shopping to a calculator. So we'll see a ton of development here, I'm sure, both from OpenAI and from open source communities on making language models that can do stuff in the world. And the notion of tool is really broad here. So one thing that very few people, I think, are wise to right now is that language models can actually guide robots with just a tiny bit of extra help. Something like GPT-4, the most recent model put out by OpenAI, or the Palm-E model from Google, can just drive a robot. It comes up with plans, it sends those plans to the lower level functions of the robot, and it can navigate a kitchen and pick up some rice chips for you. So sort of general purpose, flexible robotics, something that's been a dream at least since the Jetsons, is looking a lot more plausible than it did just 2 years ago. But maybe getting down a little bit closer to earth what you can do right now with language models. Language models know a ton about code and software. I am something of a sort of beginner Rust enthusiast, love playing around with it on little weekend hack projects. So I asked for some information about what would be some next level things that I could learn in Rust to get better at it. And this is not a particularly popular language, relative to something like Python or JavaScript or even C#, but it knows a ton about Rust. So this is an interface for talking directly with the language models underneath ChatGPT, the OpenAI interface, and we can see it knows a bunch of intermediate Rust libraries for web development, for cryptography, for all kinds of stuff. And that's where I think there's the most opportunity for improving your productivity right now by incorporating language models into your workflows. And so, like using their knowledge of code and of software, you can make yourself a more effective developer. But the question is, like, where can you do that? So I'm here to provide a little heuristic for where language models can probably help you. If somebody offered you a new grad new hire who happens to be very into Reddit, and that person will be on call 24/7. If you hear that and you think, I know exactly what I want to do with that person, then you can probably use ChatGPT right now to accomplish some of your tasks. So the particular task we're going to end up on is OpenAPI Spec enrichment, and we'll see that Speakeasy is a critical part of making that workflow work. So a mental model of the intelligence of ChatGPT, or like what kind of intelligences does it have? It kind of behaves like a fully automated Redditor. So Reddit is a forum website, a sort of forum of forums that's very popular with a certain type of individual. In the dominant sort of culture of Reddit is maybe expressed by these pictures in the top right of a typical Redditor that I generated with a text-to-image system called Stable Diffusion. So the automated Redditor is something of a median Silicon Valley 20-something. There's some academic research to back this idea up. They're generally very confident in tone and resistant to correction, unless you can really strongly prove your point. They are fluent on everything. They have an opinion on everything, and they can be very convincing. But if you're a real expert in the opinion in the thing they're talking about, you're like, wait a second, there's some issues here. And then they don't seem to have spent much time outside. Their knowledge of the internet is really great. Their knowledge of the physical world can sometimes be a little bit limited. So that's one mental model for sort of like, what are these models like? What do they know? An important way that interacts with using them effectively in your job that touches code and software is that they end up behaving kind of similarly to a new hire who just graduated from a university. So, and the key here is that this is the new grad, new hire for whatever you're hiring for. So you're hiring for an API developer, you're hiring for a designer, you're hiring for a backend, and these models will sort of behave as though they were that junior level person at whatever you're hiring them for. They'll be a little bit better at the more common tasks, which is also true of new hires. So they're probably going to be better at doing API calls in Python than they are at writing embedded C. But they're kind of at this junior level for everything. And then what are the things that new hires and new grads need in order to be successful in their jobs? Well, they need onboarding in order to get them up to speed. So they need context and information. They're not necessarily autonomous yet. They need really direct and clear instructions on well-scoped tasks. They're really best suited for the kind of like low complexity, well-scoped kinds of problems, not the like high complexity, like broad scope problems like make my business better, or how do we resolve like making our DevX better. And they're not really fully reliable. Like you can't just like have them push code direct to prod with no oversight. But they can usually fix mistakes if you can point them out to them. So if they run code and it fails a test, then they can probably get it to pass that test. And so the key thing that makes new grads more productive for this in this last piece here is that they need good developer tooling. So senior and staff engineers often spend a good amount of their time building the kind of automation kind of tooling and workflows that ensure that people who don't have their context, that don't have their skill set, can still develop effectively and confidently. And the same thing is basically true for these artificial new hires that come from our language models. And so let's walk through what that looks like for OpenAPI specs. These OpenAPI specs turn out to be a great target for language models as a tool for improving your workflows, in particular, thanks to Speakeasy. Ewan is asking about whether this is a cautionary tale about integrating AI into your activities. I would say that I advise deliberate caution when using these models. I would not I have not given them pseudo access to my shell on my personal machine, for example, but I would probably do it inside of a Docker container. And we'll see that there are in fact errors that come up with these that mean you don't want to just hook it straight to prod. So let's. I think it's best to just jump into the demo at this point of the interaction between ChatGPT and Speakeasy, our API management tool, represented here by this sweet robotic bee, also generated with stable diffusion. So let's dive into that demo. We want to go here. Let's dive in here, and let me do a little zooming so it's a little easier to see. And for now, I'm just going to focus on one of the two interfaces now. So this is the chat interface for OpenAI's language models. You can also, if you get interested in developing these things, you don't have to stick with the chat interface. You can join the developer program, start hooking up using these things via an API. I'm sticking with the chat interface for this one because it's just, it's easier to demo, and it's also going to be easier for you to get started if you want to try this out for yourself. So the most intelligent of OpenAI's models, which is currently behind a paywall, so you would have to pay in order to get this, is GPT-4. So GPT-4 just came out, I don't know, 1 week ago, 10 days ago, and things are kind of moving at light speed in this field. But it came out very recently and is very, very capable it has the ability to take in maybe, let's say, 1,000 lines of code, maybe 700 lines of code, and answer questions coherently about all that whole collection of 700 lines of code. So one thing you can do is if you have an OpenAPI spec that fits in, 500 to 700 lines, you can just drop right in and ask for commentary on it. So I went to one of the previous Speakeasy webinars and grabbed one of the specs that Sugar enriched. Sugar, the co-founder and CEO of Speakeasy, he demonstrated how a human who's an expert like him might go about improving an OpenAPI spec and making it, sort of like improving it and using Speakeasy as part of the process of improvement. So I'm going to kind of, in this webinar, what I'm kind of demonstrating is how might that look if you're not a total expert in OpenAPI specs like me, you're not as good as Sugar, but you have GPT models to help you. So I just grabbed the OpenAPI spec and just pasted it in. And I said, hey, can you provide some commentary on this spec? What's done well? What could be improved? And I asked for some clear and concise reasoning for the claims. So this doesn't look that different to how you might interact with maybe, Speakeasy's engineers as they're helping you like sort of stand up and deploy your API documentation, the SDKs. You could ask them the same question, but in keeping with our new grad, new hire thing, we want to make sure that we're even more clear and we're more direct in the things that we're asking for. Of course, experts like the folks at Speakeasy need a lot less hand holding. But so yeah, I just copied it and pasted it in, and I got an answer. So I got this sort of bullet point style answer from GPT-4. It types a little bit slower than a person, GPT-4 does. So it's sometimes you kind of find yourself sort of sitting and like reading it word by word. Maybe you want to switch tabs for a second and come back the way you might if you're doing a Slack conversation with a colleague. I would say it's just a tiny bit faster than most of my Slack conversations with colleagues, and it has a lower probability of leaving to use the restroom. So that's about the kind of speed here. That's why I'm not doing it live, by the way. It's just a little bit too slow for a live demo. So some of the strengths so it actually pulls out some of the strengths and the weaknesses of this spec that I grabbed from Sugar. So that's actually kind of a nice feature of these things. Like it's for increasing your understanding of text often, not just for like completing some specific workflow. That's a really nice way to use these chat things. If you look at the left-hand side of the screen, you can kind of see that I've been learning about lots of things using the chat interface. It also pulls out some areas for improvement. So let me jump down here to this list of improvements that it suggests for the OpenAPI spec. So it says, okay, we're missing, so one is the error handling. There's all these default responses here. So rather than being like, oh, there's like bad requests that are 400s, there's 500 errors for times when the server messes up, like, that's not here in the OpenAPI spec. I wanted to focus on things that were sort of just at the kind of like metadata level, just at the spec level. Something like that would require going back to the actual service and checking like, oh wait, what are the error messages that can be put here? So if you have, if you're being full stack about it, you definitely can do that and use these language models to help you. And they can also make you better at doing things like interfacing with the JavaScript layer or interfacing with the backend, because you can copy and paste the code you come across into these models and get explanations, not just OpenAPI specs. But zooming in a little bit more on the OpenAPI spec side of things and what we can do right now here in this demo, missing request body for post/pets. Specification does not define the expected request body for the post/pets endpoint. To create a new pet, a request body should be provided specifying the required data for creating a pet. So I forgot to mention what is this API here? It's the classic example that people use in the OpenAPI world. It's a pet store. So you can check what pets are there. You can check for a particular pet, and you can add a new pet to it. So very basic, the sort of thing like you might do as a Hello World project as you start learning about specifications of APIs and about running backends. And then another thing that it points out is we're missing operation IDs. So operation IDs are, in addition to just like a combination of a path and a type of request, like get pets, OpenAPI specs allow you to add some metadata called an operation ID that gives a semantic name to this combination. So it's like I told you what this API could do. I said you could get pets, you could add pets, right? That's semantically meaningful. That's meaningful to humans. It's and it's different than the like syntactical structure of the API. That's things like a get request to/pets, which is much less. It's much less semantic. Those are just like strings of characters that you provide, and that are the interface between your clients and the server. So fixing errors is one thing that these models can do. So they could write OpenAPI spec content that's like syntactically meaningful, like adding in the request body here. And they can also do these kind of semantic things. So they have enough understanding of text that they can come up with names for the operations, names for like what does it mean to get pets. They can come up with that operation ID. So that was done with GPT-4. So I took the GPT-4 suggestions. GPT-4, as I said, is kind of slow. So I switched over to GPT-3.5 Turbo, which is much faster. This thing types at like 500 words per minute and is much faster than interacting with a human colleague to solve problems. And since I wanted to like have an iterative back and forth process of updating this OpenAPI spec, and now I'm just following these instructions rather than coming up with new ideas about how to fix things, I switched over to a model that's faster, but maybe a little bit less intelligent, a little bit less capable. So that's this GPT 3.5 here. So I just copied and pasted that spec again. So that's down here at the bottom. And I also copied and pasted those two of the suggestions, actually a third suggestion as well from my previous iteration. Also add examples to the API, add examples to our schemas. There's a question from Shy. How would GPT do with evaluating high order concepts like the Richardson maturity model? I'm not familiar with that model. So if you could just type just like a little bit about it, and I can try and answer that question more clearly. Just yeah, and I'll get back to that once we've moved through a little bit more of this example. Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah. So Shai's asking like, okay, like would it notice that you're using a get in a place where you're like changing state? Would it notice that you're using a post in a place where you're just reading? Yeah, I think if that is readable from the OpenAPI specification, just from looking at the specification without looking at the underlying code, which I'm not sure you always guaranteed to be the case, it should be able to pick up on things like that. So if you, and in general, just ask what you might ask in your prompt at the top. You might say like, does it follow best practices for API development? Right? I just asked like, what's done well, what could be improved. You can incorporate your own notion of best practices here. You could actually just ask, like, does this follow the Richardson maturity model? Unlike me, GPT-4 definitely knows very clearly what the Richardson maturity model is, having been trained on all of Google. To first approximation, like pretty much everything indexed by Google. Great, so I pasted some stuff. I pasted that spec in, and it generated this thing in like about as much time as it took me to paste it in, very, very quickly. I might actually, maybe if I click the regenerate response, you can see how quick it runs. There we go. Yeah. So here we go. So that's what it looks like as it's generating. You can see like much faster than a person types. It's generating an example or a response to what I requested. Okay, so going back up here, it generated this the OpenAPI spec, and there's this convenient little copy code little button here that you can use to copy it. And now you can take that and start using it as your OpenAPI spec if you want. And so now I'm going to switch over to my VS Code setup, and and I'm going to show you what that looks like. So I've got left and right here, I've got the original spec that I took from Sugger's example, and on the right, I've got what came out of GPT 3.5 on my first try. So I can run a little quick comparison job down here to compare these two files. So I see that it added an operation ID and it added that request body that I asked for. So that's on the right side here. It also added a new schema. It actually added I didn't directly request this, but it recognized that there was an opportunity to add a new schema to our components for new pets, not just pets as a resource, but the resource that's required to create a new pet. So that's pretty nicely done, I would say. It also added an operation ID there, and we can see, yeah, we've got that new pet schema. I would say it's not quite as good as the one that Sugger did by hand, but it was a lot cheaper to create. So while I'm sort of comparing these two specs next to each other, I want to answer Monica's question. Can it compare two versions and merge two OpenAPI specs? Definitely. If I were to like copy and paste these two things in, then and ask for a comparison, it would definitely work, subject to one restriction, which is that if it's more than about 600, 700 lines of code, you're likely to run into its like memory limits. So there's like a limit in how much stuff it can store in its like memory and pay attention to at any given moment. That's going to go up by a factor of 4 at some point in the next couple of months. With specifically the GPT-4 model, it's going to go up 4x, and that's enough to store like many software libraries fit within this sort of like 2,000 to 4,000 lines of code size that's going to fit in that model. So it's a light restriction, and there are, like, if you're programming stuff, if you're writing your own extension or tooling, when Speakeasy creates their own tooling, there's lots of ways to get around that. But if you're just doing the copy paste workflow that I'm showing, you're stuck with that limitation. But yeah, great question. Thanks, Monica. Okay, so let's so if you're a security-minded person, you might be like screaming right now because I just suggested that you should copy and paste untrusted code generated by this artificial agent who is not suable, and I suggested like make that your OpenAPI spec, and you're done. So this is where tools like Speakeasy come in. This is an extremely critical component. It might feel small right now because it's taking up less time of my demo, but it's absolutely critical. What it can do is check and validate that you didn't mess something up when you copied and pasted that YAML in, that GPT 3.5 didn't do something wrong. So let's check that. And in fact, on this example, which I swear to God is not cherry-picked, it is actually just the first thing that came out, it made a mistake that Speakeasy could catch. It did not, in fact, add an operation ID for that pet's path. So this is a metadata mistake. So rather than like a mistake in terms of, so it's just a warning there. You see there's a yellow warning instead of like a red error. So this isn't like something that would have broken production, but it does mean that we are like, that something was wrong or missing about this specification. And so the model messed up and Speakeasy was able to catch it. And so I understand what this warning means, so I just typed what the mistake was and sent it back to the model. So if we look here back in our chat interface, I say, oh, you forgot to provide an operation ID for get pets. I also asked for the example to be changed to the name of my pet, QWERTY, instead of a cat named Fluffy. But the main thing was fixing that error that Speakeasy caught. But you could also just paste error messages, just paste warnings and error messages that come out, and usually the model is able to figure out what that means and come up with a resolution. So this works also in like programming languages you're not familiar with. It's really incredible. You can see there's some examples on the side there of JavaScript stuff that I was messing around with. It was very, very helpful to be able to talk to the models. So it generates a fix, and going back to my VS Code setup, where are we at? So let's do /compare our fixed version. So once again, it's just a copy and paste, and we can see it added that operation ID for get pets. And we see we still have the same changes that came previously, and we've also got that change down here in the schema. So that's all cool. I love that. Then the other, so there's two things that I could show right now. Like I was just showing you some YAML files, just showing you the OpenAPI specs. Like, your developers don't care about the literal spec. They, like the people who are consuming your API, like some of them will care about the quality and cleanliness and the best practices evinced by your OpenAPI spec, but really what they care about is the like downstream stuff that they consume, that they see. So I think the thing to do here is to show a comparison of just like a snippet of code from the Python SDKs that come out of these OpenAPI specs. So that's a feature of Speakeasy. Speakeasy can generate like client SDKs, so libraries for consumers of your API to use in their preferred languages. So my preferred language is Python as a machine learning person, so I can generate one in Python. I'm going to generate one SDK on the basis of the enriched spec, and then I'm going to generate another one on the basis of the unenriched spec, so the one before we tasked ChatGPT with fixing it. So Speakeasy generate SDK, lang Python, and now I'm going to go with the starting YAML, the YAML that we started with here. So we've now got two folders here, enriched and start, that are our two SDKs. And let me just compare some of them, some of their features to each other. So closing that, pulling that bad boy down. Okay, so this is an example usage snippet. Let me show it to you via Markdown. So all of that was just generated live right now with Speakeasy. So it generated not only the library, but also like a little bit of documentation. And the more stuff you add to your OpenAPI spec, the more that Speakeasy can do for you for free in generating this downstream artifact, this SDK and its documentation. So enriching these specs using, using the language model tooling gets you better SDKs. So this SDK was based off of our starting unenriched spec, and you can see like operations.getPetsRequest. That's not very Pythonic, It's not very natural. You're saying like, let me look at my operations and like find this getPetsRequest. It's not like semantically like the way a person is thinking when they want to use the API. They think in terms of like pets in the pet store, not in terms of requests and gets and things like that. There's also, because of the limits in the metadata, there's like not much that can be done in picking a good example of this API. So let's take that enriched specification and let's take a look at its usage example. So in its usage example, we have we're drawing from a shared set here. Oops. I want to stick with the preview. We're drawing from a shared set of operations here, and we're pulling out a new pet. We're trying to create a new pet. This is much closer to the way a person is thinking when they're using their API than getPetsRequest. They're thinking, I want a new pet with a name and a tag. And then they want to create that pet. So they want to call the SDK with create pet with this particular request. And so that's kind of a tiny example, right? We're just looking at like 2 or 3 lines of code. So totally, this is a very hello worldy example. But this core idea of making your SDKs more ergonomic, this is something that requires, like, if you want those SDKs to be both automatically generated and ergonomic, you need a well-enriched OpenAPI specification so that the consumers downstream that generate your API spec have a lot of stuff to go off of in building out the SDK and in creating examples and documentation for it. If you're the type of person who is downstream of OpenAPI specs, so maybe you're a technical writer, documentation writer, or developer advocate, that you're very familiar with this, and maybe you don't need me to tell you that a better spec leads to these better outcomes downstream for developers. But yeah, so, and I do want to hammer home like this SDK generation process that comes from Speakeasy that doesn't involve the language models. The language models aren't writing this code for you. It's, at least for now, it's Speakeasy taking advantage of the syntactic information and the metadata in your OpenAPI spec. And that's the core thing going on here. So again, Speakeasy Speakeasy was helping me make sure that I could trust the outputs of the language model, back to the question about whether this was going to be a cautionary tale or not. Speakeasy was there to make sure that I didn't make mistakes. It's there to validate the outputs of the language model, but it also allows me to make better use of the outputs of the language model. The language model outputs an OpenAPI spec, and Speakeasy is ready to scoop that up and go run with it. So connecting language models to other kinds of developer tooling around documentation and around code, and around things that are half documentation, half code, like OpenAPI specs, this is a really exciting future for language models in the world of software in general. So that's the core bit of the demo there. And the takeaway is Speakeasy helps you with syntax. Other dev tools that you love are probably also good at syntactic type operations on language and code, generating SDKs, evaluating and executing code, testing code, AST parsing. They're really great at that, but they don't know that much about the meaning of things. They don't have that human touch. The developer tools like Speakeasy's command line interface. Because they haven't seen, they're classic computer programs. They are not built with that in them. Oh, whoops! I got a little slide error down there. Let me fix that. Boom. There we go. So the language models are really good at semantic operations. They can do some syntactic-y stuff, like they can try to evaluate and execute code. They can try to do AST parsing. They aren't that good at it, but they are really good at these semantic operations, like documentation writing, test case generation as opposed to test case execution, and handling things like, is this generated SDK ergonomic or not? So it's this really awesome pairing of like classic developer tools that like people have been spending decades like honing and refining and making those workflows good, and now we've got this awesome new superpower that locks into them of doing semantic operations on the same targets on code and on language. So if you're interested in incorporating Speakeasy as one of these dev tools, you can sign up for the demo. I think Nolan, if you can share a link in the chat. Sorry, I said sign up for a demo. Sign up for Speakeasy. It's available. It's out there. Uh, uh, Nolan, if you could share a link for folks to sign up. And then the one thing that I just want to leave us with before I switch over to answering questions for the last 5-10 minutes of this is like I showed a workflow that's possible kind of like right now, like Speakeasy as it currently exists as a command line tool and language models as they currently like exist as like an interface you can play with like a free account. But there's a lot more here, and I've been talking about it with with the folks at Speakeasy, and there's a lot more that can be done with language models, and there's a lot more that can be done at this particular intersection. So one thing I did was after having some conversations with folks at Speakeasy about what they thought the possibilities were, I went to the model and I asked it what its opinions were. And in fact, I asked it to pretend to be an expert in OpenAPI, so to pretend to be Sugger of Speakeasy, and to have a conversation with me about how artificial intelligence and OpenAPI tooling could work together. So I gave my thoughts on what these models were good at and bad at, and then I got back a nice simulation of what Sugger said. It identified a couple of use cases, so generating API documentation. Rather than manually writing detailed descriptions for each endpoint and parameter, a language model could analyze the spec and generate human-readable documentation automatically. So we kind of saw that today with generating those operation IDs. You can dive real far down that if you want. Another use case would be improving accuracy of testing. That's a cool one. That's also one that we'd come up with internally, discussing options. And then also for generating client code. That's another idea that we discussed internally and that the language model was also able to come up with. So not just doing the SDK generation the way it's currently done based off of the OpenAPI spec and based off of automated tooling for sort of crawling, parsing, and handling that specification, but also adding a little language model magic to improve the quality and ergonomicity of those generated SDKs. And as any good proposer of technology should do, the model also, our virtual Sugger also said that it explained what the benefits were. It can reduce the burden on developers and potentially reduce the amount of time and effort required for development. So these are all ideas that people are thinking about and working on in Speakeasy as ways to possibly improve the quality of their offering, which is upstream of you being able to offer a higher quality experience for people who are consumers of your APIs or people who are working on APIs at your organization. So I think there's exciting times ahead for this field as a whole, and like both broad fields of language models and artificial intelligence and API creation and consumption, and also for folks like Speakeasy working at that intersection. So that's everything that I had. So I'd like to open the floor up for questions. We've got at least another minute or two to answer questions, and I think maybe we even have up until 50 minutes after the hour, so another 5 minutes if folks have any questions. I'll also say that there was a poll asking whether folks had tried ChatGPT, and it looks like about 60% had, 10% had not, and 20% were actually just language models trained by OpenAI. So that's great to see. All right, I haven't seen any questions come in. It's that chat thing at the side there you should be able to see. I'm happy to answer any particular questions about the demo, any questions about the underlying technology. Been working on artificial intelligence kind of area for the last 10 years. Came out to the Bay Area to do graduate school on neural networks about 10 years ago. Well, I guess folks got their questions out during the session, maybe. So much gratitude to the folks who asked great questions. Ewan, Monica, Shai, thanks for asking. Hopefully, everything was sufficiently clear that you don't feel that there are any questions to ask, rather than so unclear that you can't even begin asking questions. Oh, great, they're coming in. All right. So a question from Lisa. Should API technical writers be concerned? I think this is a great question because it's on a lot of people's minds. Like, to what extent does this threaten my ability to do my, does this threaten my job? I think that the answer for almost everybody on this is no. There's a bunch of examples going back, through the last century and a half of times that people were worried that a new piece of technology would automate people out of jobs. So automated teller machines, ATMs, it's right there. It's automating the tellers. But there are in fact not fewer bank tellers now than there were before ATMs. There's a great figure for this that demonstrates that the amount of bank tellers maybe stopped going up as fast as it did before ATMs. But really what ATMs did was they allowed bank tellers to spend more time working on harder problems and less time counting money and checking people's credit card numbers. And so that's what I think is going to happen here in pretty much every place that these models are likely to be deployed. For at least the next 5 years, the things are changing fast. And so in 5 and 10 years, who knows what can happen? I have generally been surprised by how quickly these models get better. But it's still that's just that's further on the horizon, and there will be some warning, I think, ahead of time. For right now, what this means is that the first step of going from blank page to something getting ideas on paper, that's now automatable, and that's huge because I don't know about you, but when I'm sitting down to write something, I really hate that moment where there's just a blank page and I need to start writing stuff. I really struggle with it. So that's a way to make technical writers more efficacious. And I think in general, if your organization was willing to pay for technical writers to make sure that their API documentation was good, I think they're still going to be willing to pay for technical writers to improve the quality of what comes out of these automated systems, or to help with their maintenance. It requires not just a programmer's or an engineer's perspective on language. It requires also a writer's perspective on language to use these systems most effectively. I will say that if you're a technical writer and you are not looking into using these things in your workflows, you should be concerned because other people will start to get really good at the responsibilities of technical writing. They'll get better faster without these. In the same way that if you were a secretary who refused to use email, you would eventually find that it was hard to get jobs. Because most people would prefer a more efficacious secretary who uses email. And I think that, by the way, it doesn't just go for technical writers. I think that also goes for software developers. I make extensive use of these models when I'm writing code, and I think everybody should. Yeah, Nolan had a question. The pace of development in the AI space seems to be red hot. Do you think it's going to continue to accelerate? I think it might continue to accelerate for a while. And in particular, the open source options are going to get much better, much faster. I think it will be challenging for them to catch up to the state of the art that's closed source right now. And then for I doubt that it's gonna like continue accelerating forever in some like giant exponential curve that ends with us with faster than light space travel or whatever the sort of like singularity people think. I think it's eventually gonna plateau. It's hard to say where that plateau is gonna be. Whether it looks like, oh wow, we just got really great autocomplete and really great like additional tooling to help us in our jobs, or whether it looks like in 10 years it's accelerated so much that it's like, oh yeah, tons and tons of jobs are automated. A little unclear. Thanks. We're running out of time, so I will stick around to answer Hannah's question in case they are sticking around and can stick past the 12:50 ending line. Hannah asked, I read about concerns around users pasting proprietary information into GPT-like tools and then that information being retrievable later on. What's your take on this concern? So I think it's important if you are going to be using this in like serious work where there are these like concerns about proprietary information, concerns about intellectual property. It's important to read the terms of service pretty carefully, and you might need guidance from your legal team on what is and is not advisable here. And definitely some legal teams and some organizations have just been like absolutely not. So there are places with terms of service that are generally completely acceptable. So Notion. Notion AI, Notion, the like document service, has Notion AI, which is just like a wrapper around these language models, and they promise not to train anything on your models. And OpenAI says that people who use their stuff via an API, people who use their tools and models via like a programmatic interface and as part of like a production service, they promise not to do any training on that data, and so it should not be leaked. And so, it is hard to, like, we don't have as good rules and procedures in place around data governance for these things as we do for databases and search systems and all these other things where people have worked hard to write down data governance rules, tooling, procedures, best practices, like literal jurisprudence. So we don't have that yet. So that can be scary for larger organizations. So to a certain extent, we'll see that shake out. I would doubt that most people, for example, in governments, can be comfortable using these tools with stuff that is, protected information. So that is a current restriction, but something that a lot of people want to unlock, and that there will be lots of legal and judicial and legislative activity in the next year to 5 years resolving those things. All right, that's even more than all the time that we had. So thanks everybody for coming and for asking great questions. Definitely try out Speakeasy as a tool for improving the quality of your developer experience for the consumers and producers of APIs in your organization. And I hope to see you around. Take care, everyone.